The first thing I heard coming up out of the anesthesia was organ music, not the steady, sterile hum of hospital machinery I had fallen asleep listening to. Organ music, distant and tinny, drifting through walls that were apparently thinner than anyone had bothered to mention to a woman recovering from a 6-hour spinal surgery. I opened my eyes to a recovery room that was almost entirely empty. No husband sitting in the chair beside my bed, the way he had promised he would be, the way he had held my hand right up until the anesthesiologist counted backward and the world went dark. No flowers. "No, you did great, baby," whispered the moment my eyes fluttered open, which is what he had told me. The night before surgery, he intended to say the very first thing I heard. Just a nurse I did not recognize, checking my vitals with brisk, practiced efficiency, and that strange, persistent organ music drifting in from somewhere down the hall. "Where's my husband?" I asked. My voice came out as little more than a dry rasp. The nurse, young, blonde, with a name tag that read Kayla, paused for half a second too long before answering. "He'll be back soon," she said. "He just had to step out for a minute." I would learn, less than 2 hours later, exactly what stepping out had meant. I would learn that the organ music drifting through the walls of St. Augustine Medical Center that afternoon was not a coincidence, not background noise from some unrelated hospital event, but the sound of my husband of 9 years standing in the hospital's small interfaith chapel, 3 floors down from my recovery room, marrying the surgical nurse who had assisted in my own operation less than 5 hours earlier. I am going to tell you exactly how I found out and exactly what I did about it. I want you to understand, before I begin, that there is no version of the story where I eventually decide to be the bigger person and forgive what happened. Some betrayals do not deserve that ending. This is one of them. My name is Vanessa Cole. I am 38 years old. I've spent the last 12 years building a successful real estate development firm in Tampa, Florida, the kind of career that required me to be sharp, methodical, and almost impossible to deceive in any business dealing I have ever entered. I want you to remember that about me because it matters enormously for understanding exactly how thoroughly my husband and his accomplice managed to deceive me anyway, right up until the moment they finally could not. I had been married to Richard Cole for 9 years. He worked as a hospital administrator, not a doctor, not directly involved in patient care, but a man who moved through the medical world with an easy familiarity, who knew the names of every department head, every chief nurse, every administrator at St. Augustine Medical Center, where he had worked for over a decade. I had a herniated disc in my lower spine that had been causing me debilitating pain for almost a year. The surgery, a spinal fusion, 6 hours under anesthesia, a recovery that would require weeks of careful attention, had been scheduled for months. Richard had insisted, repeatedly, that he would be there the entire time. He had taken 2 weeks off work specifically to care for me during the recovery. He had told me, the night before the surgery, lying beside me in our bed, that he could not imagine anything more important than being there the moment I woke up. I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. I should tell you about Brianna Hale because she is the second person at the center of the story, and because I had, in the months leading up to my surgery, met her on several occasions without ever once suspecting what was actually developing between her and my husband. Brianna was 31 years old, a surgical nurse who had worked at St. Augustine for the past 4 years. She had assisted in several of my pre-surgical consultations, walking me through preparation instructions with a warmth and professionalism that had genuinely put me at ease in the weeks leading up to a surgery I was, understandably, quite anxious about. I remember thinking, more than once, what a kind, attentive nurse she seemed to be. I remember thanking her specifically, during one appointment, for taking the extra time to answer my questions thoroughly when I could tell she had other patients waiting. I had no idea, sitting in that examination room thanking her for her kindness, that she had already been involved with my husband for the better part of a year. I had no idea that the careful, attentive warmth I found so reassuring was, at least in part, the practiced demeanor of a woman who had spent months learning everything about my surgery, my recovery timeline, and the precise window of vulnerability that a 6-hour operation under general anesthesia would eventually provide her. The surgery itself, by every medical account I would later receive, went exactly as planned. 6 hours, successful fusion, no complications. I was wheeled into recovery around 2 in the afternoon, and according to hospital records, Richard had been present in the surgical waiting area for the first 3 hours, exactly as he had promised. It was sometime during the 4th hour, while I was still deep under anesthesia, while the surgical team was completing the final stages of the procedure, that everything else began unfolding without my knowledge. I would later piece together the full timeline through a combination of hospital security footage, statements from staff members who eventually came forward, and the marriage certificate itself, which carried a timestamp that would become the single most damning piece of evidence in everything that followed. At approximately 1:47 in the afternoon, while I was still on the operating table, Richard left the surgical waiting area and met Brianna, who had completed her shift assisting in my surgery only minutes earlier, outside the hospital's small interfaith chapel on the 3rd floor. They had, it would later become clear, already obtained a marriage license. They had already arranged for an officiant, a hospital chaplain named Reverend Thomas Whitfield, who would later claim, in a statement I still find difficult to fully believe, that he had simply been told this was a beautiful, spontaneous celebration of love between two people who had found each other under difficult circumstances. With no indication given that the bride had just finished assisting in a surgical procedure on the groom's current, legally married wife. They were married at 2:15 in the afternoon. The ceremony lasted, according to the chapel's sign-in log, approximately 20 minutes. I woke up from surgery at 3:40 that same afternoon. I did not learn any of this immediately. I want to be clear about the actual sequence of how the truth reached me, because the gap between waking up confused and finally understanding the full, devastating scope of what had happened was its own kind of slow-motion horror. For the first hour after I woke up, I assumed Richard's absence was exactly what the nurse, Kayla, had suggested, a brief errand, perhaps a phone call to update our families, the ordinary small absences that happen during long hospital stays. I drifted in and out of post-anesthesia grogginess, vaguely aware of the persistent organ music somewhere in the building, attributing it, in my hazy state, to some unrelated hospital event that had nothing to do with me. It was my sister, Diane, who finally pieced together what had actually happened, and who delivered the news to me with a combination of horror and disbelief that I will never forget. Diane had arrived at the hospital around 4 in the afternoon, expecting to find Richard already in my recovery room, the way he had promised our entire family he would be. Instead, she found me alone, confused, asking repeatedly where my husband had gone. She went looking for him. She found him in the hospital's small chapel waiting area, sitting beside Brianna Hale, a woman Diane recognized immediately from photographs I had shown her of my surgical team, both of them still in their formal attire, Richard in a suit I did not even know he owned, Brianna in a simple white dress, surrounded by a small handful of witnesses Diane did not recognize at all. There was a wedding cake, modest but unmistakable, sitting on a small table nearby. Diane stood in that doorway for what she later described as a full 10 seconds, unable to process what she was actually looking at, before the chaplain, apparently still under the impression this was a celebration worth congratulating, turned to her with a warm smile and said, "Are you here for the wedding?" It was such a beautiful ceremony. Diane came back to my recovery room white-faced, shaking and unable for several agonizing minutes to find the words to tell me what she had just witnessed. "Vanessa," she said finally, sitting on the edge of my bed, taking both of my hands in hers with a gentleness that immediately told me, before she had said anything else, that whatever was coming was going to be devastating. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm because of your surgery, but I also need you to know the truth right now." "What is it?" I said. My voice was still weak from the anesthesia, but something in her face had already sent a cold, sick feeling spreading through my chest. "Richard got married," she said. "Today. 3 floors down. In the hospital chapel. To Brianna, the nurse from your surgery." I want to describe as precisely as I can what happened in my body in the moment those words actually landed. I did not cry immediately. I did not scream. I lay there in that hospital bed, my spine held together with hardware that had been surgically implanted only hours earlier, and I felt something that I can only describe as the floor of my entire understanding of reality simply dropping away beneath me. That's not possible, I said. I'm his wife. We've been married for 9 years. He can't. I know, Diane said, her voice breaking. I know, Vanessa. I saw it myself. There's a cake. There were witnesses. The chaplain thought I was a guest who'd arrived late. I lay in that bed, surrounded by monitors tracking my vital signs, my body still recovering from major surgery, and I understood, with a clarity that cut through even the lingering fog of anesthesia, that my husband had not simply betrayed me. He had committed bigamy. He had married another woman while still legally married to me, in the very building where I was recovering from surgery that he had promised, repeatedly, to be present for. And he had timed it, deliberately and with calculated precision, to the exact window when I would be completely unconscious and unable to stop him. I want to take a moment here to explain what I would eventually learn about why Richard chose this specific, almost unbelievable timing, because the reasoning behind it reveals a level of premeditation that, even now, makes my skin crawl. It would take several weeks of legal investigation, hired private investigators, and eventually a deposition process to fully understand the financial architecture underlying everything Richard and Brianna had done. But the core of it, once it finally emerged, was devastatingly simple. My real estate development firm, the business I had spent 12 years building, held a substantial life insurance policy on me, a policy Richard had encouraged me to take out years earlier, ostensibly to protect the business and our household finances in the event of my death, given the genuine risks of a major spinal surgery and the general uncertainties of life. Richard was the named beneficiary. What I would eventually learn, through the careful work of a forensic financial investigator named Patrick Soto, was that Richard had researched extensively the surgical risks associated with the specific spinal fusion procedure I was scheduled to undergo. Major spinal surgery, while generally safe, does carry real risk, infection, complications under anesthesia, the genuine possibility, however statistically small, of death on the operating table. Richard had apparently convinced himself, based on conversations he'd had with Brianna about the procedure's risks, that there was a meaningful chance I might not survive the surgery. And rather than simply waiting to see what happened, rather than continuing the affair quietly until some future point when divorce might be the more conventional path forward, he and Brianna had decided to position themselves for an entirely different outcome. If I had died on that operating table, Richard would have inherited the full life insurance payout as my surviving spouse, and he would have already, conveniently, had a new marriage in place, eliminating any awkward gap, any uncomfortable period of mourning that might have delayed his and Brianna's plans to move forward together with the financial windfall my death would have provided. The marriage in the chapel that afternoon was not, as I initially assumed, simply an act of impatience or carelessness by two people too eager to formalize an affair. It was, according to everything Patrick's investigation eventually uncovered, a calculated contingency plan, one that happened to proceed regardless of whether I survived the surgery, because by the time the ceremony took place, Richard and Brianna had apparently decided they were no longer willing to wait for an outcome that was, statistically, unlikely to occur in their favor anyway. I survived the surgery. They proceeded with their plan as though I hadn't. I confronted Richard for the first time 4 days after I woke up from surgery, once I had been discharged from the hospital and moved into my sister's guest room rather than my own home, which I refused, on principle and on the explicit advice of an attorney I had already contacted, to return to. He came to Diane's house, looking, I will admit, genuinely uncertain of his welcome, a small, strange consolation that he at least understood, on some level, that what he had done was not something he could simply explain away with an easy apology. Vanessa, he said, standing awkwardly in Diane's living room while I sat, still recovering, in a chair specifically positioned to support my still healing back. I know how this looks. How it looks, I repeated. My voice was flat, carrying none of the rage I genuinely felt, because somewhere in those 4 days, my fury had calcified into something colder and more deliberate. Richard, you married another woman while I was unconscious on an operating table. There is no version of how this looks that doesn't end at exactly what it actually is. I love her, he said, which struck me, even in the moment, as an almost laughably inadequate response to the scope of what he had done. I know this is the worst possible way for you to find out, but Brianna and I— Stop, I said. I don't want to hear about your feelings for her. I want to understand exactly what you did, and exactly why you chose that specific moment to do it. He hesitated. I watched something flicker across his face. Not quite guilt, but something closer to calculation, a man trying to determine how much I already knew before deciding how much more to reveal. It wasn't planned the way you think, he said carefully. We'd been talking about getting married for a while. The timing it happened to line up with your surgery date, and we thought, since everyone we needed was already at the hospital that day— Don't lie to me, I said, my voice still flat, still controlled, though something underneath it had begun, finally, to harden into genuine ice. I already know about the life insurance policy, Richard. I already know you researched the surgical risks. I already have an investigator documenting the full timeline of exactly how long you and Brianna planned this. His face went pale. Whatever careful explanation he had been preparing collapsed visibly, replaced by the specific look of a man realizing that the lie he had been counting on was no longer survivable. It wasn't, Vanessa, I never wanted anything to happen to you, he said, his voice rising now, panic bleeding through. I just thought, if something did happen, it would be better to already have things settled, rather than dealing with everything afterward in a complicated, messy way. You hoped I would die on that table, I said. The words came out quiet, almost gentle, which made them somehow more devastating than if I had screamed them. And when I didn't, you went ahead with your plan anyway, because you'd apparently already decided you didn't care which version of events actually occurred. He did not have an answer for that. I do not think there was an answer that could have adequately addressed it. I want to tell you about the legal process that followed, because the unraveling of what Richard and Brianna had done required not just personal confrontation but a careful, methodical legal reckoning, and I think the full scope of that reckoning matters. My attorney, a sharp, formidable woman named Eleanor Castellano, made one thing clear to me immediately during our first meeting. The marriage between Richard and Brianna was not simply a moral betrayal. It was legally void from the moment it was performed because Richard had still been legally married to me at the time. Bigamy is a criminal offense in Florida, carrying real legal consequences beyond the obvious dissolution of whatever fraudulent marriage had been constructed. This isn't going to be handled with a quiet, private divorce, Eleanor told me. This is going to involve criminal referral, an immediate annulment proceeding for the fraudulent marriage, and a civil case addressing both the financial deception around the insurance policy and the deliberate, premeditated nature of what he did to you during your surgical recovery. What about Brianna? I asked. Does she face any consequences for her part in this? She may, Eleanor said carefully. It depends significantly on what we can establish about her knowledge and intent. If we can prove she knowingly participated in a bigamous marriage with full awareness that Richard was still legally married to you, and especially if we can establish her involvement in the broader financial scheme involving the insurance policy, she could face her own legal exposure, separate from whatever consequences Richard faces. The investigation that followed, conducted jointly by Eleanor's legal team and Patrick Soto's forensic financial work, uncovered a relationship timeline that stretched back almost 14 months before my surgery, far longer than the recent, spontaneous affair Richard had initially tried to suggest during our confrontation. Text messages, recovered through the discovery process, revealed conversations between Richard and Brianna discussing my surgical risk factors in disturbing, clinical detail. One message, dated almost 3 months before my surgery, read simply, *, Dr. Patterson says complication rate for fusion at her age and level is around 3 to 5%. Not huge, but not nothing either. *, another message, sent the week before my surgery from Brianna to Richard. *, I'll make sure I'm assigned to the surgical team. I want to be there either way. I read that message during a deposition review session with Eleanor, sitting in her office with a cup of coffee I never managed to drink, and I felt something in my chest collapse entirely, understanding finally and completely that Brianna's warmth toward me during those pre-surgical consultations had never been genuine kindness at all. It had been, from the very beginning, careful positioning, a woman ensuring she would be present for whatever outcome the surgery produced, prepared either to comfort a grieving husband or to immediately formalize a marriage that had apparently already been planned regardless of how the surgery itself went. The criminal case against Richard moved forward over the following several months. Bigamy charges were filed. The financial investigation into the insurance policy revealed enough premeditation, the specific research into surgical mortality rates, the carefully timed marriage license application, the deliberate scheduling of the ceremony to coincide with exactly the window when I would be unconscious and unable to intervene, that prosecutors ultimately added additional charges related to fraud and conspiracy. Brianna, facing her own legal exposure once the full scope of her knowledge and participation became clear through the discovered text messages, eventually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Her cooperation provided additional, devastating detail about exactly how long the affair had actually lasted, and exactly how deliberately both she and Richard had discussed the financial implications of my potential death on the operating table. I want to describe, as honestly as I can, what it felt like sitting through depositions, reading transcripts, absorbing detail after detail of exactly how calculated and sustained this betrayal had actually been. It did not feel like a single wound reopening repeatedly. It felt like discovering, piece by piece, that the wound itself was far larger and far deeper than I had initially understood, extending backward through more than a year of my life that I had believed, with complete confidence, was simply an ordinary, happy marriage. The marriage annulment proceeded quickly. Given the clear bigamy involved, Brianna and Richard's union was declared legally void, as though it had never existed at all, which felt, in some strange way, like a small, bitter consolation. The chapel ceremony, the cake, the witnesses, the entire performance of love and commitment they had staged 3 floors below my unconscious body. None of it had ever actually been legally real. My own divorce from Richard proceeded separately, complicated significantly by the criminal proceedings unfolding alongside it. Eleanor fought, successfully, to ensure that the divorce settlement reflected not just an ordinary division of marital assets, but the specific, calculated nature of what Richard had attempted, the deliberate exploitation of my medical vulnerability, the premeditated financial scheme, the sheer, almost unbelievable timing of everything he had done. I want to tell you about the moment that affected me most deeply throughout this entire ordeal, because I think it captures something essential about the specific cruelty of what happened that goes beyond even the bigamy and the financial fraud. About 6 weeks after my surgery, once I had largely recovered physically and was deep in the process of legal proceedings against Richard, I received a call from Reverend Thomas Whitfield, the hospital chaplain who had unknowingly officiated the bigamous wedding and who had, I would learn, been struggling considerably with guilt over his unwitting role in the entire affair. "Mrs. Cole," he said, his voice carrying genuine distress, "I wanted to call you directly, rather than simply through the legal proceedings, because I think you deserve to hear this from me personally. I had no idea what I was actually officiating that day. I want you to understand that completely." "I believe you," I said. And I did. Nothing in the investigation had ever suggested the chaplain was a knowing participant in the scheme, simply an unwitting tool used by 2 people skilled at managing exactly what information different parties were allowed to have. "There's something I think you should know," he continued. "Something that's been weighing on me since this all came out. During the ceremony, your husband," he hesitated. "Richard said something in his vows that I performed in complete good faith, believing it was simply heartfelt language about new beginnings. Looking back now, knowing everything I know, it strikes me very differently." "What did he say?" "He said," the Reverend continued carefully, "that he felt like he was finally being given a second chance at the life he was always meant to have. At the time, I assumed he meant something general, a man who'd perhaps been through a difficult divorce, finding new love. Now, knowing the actual context, I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling something cold and final settle into place. Richard had stood in that chapel, 3 floors above his unconscious wife's surgical incision, and described marrying his mistress as a second chance at a life he felt he deserved, language that, in light of everything else, suggested he had genuinely begun thinking of our actual marriage, of the life we had built together over 9 years, as something to be escaped rather than honored, regardless of whether I survived the procedure that was, at that exact moment, still being completed on the operating table below him. "Thank you for telling me," I said to the Reverend. "I know this wasn't your fault, but I appreciate you having the courage to call me directly." "I'm so sorry," he said, "for whatever it's worth, which I understand may not be much. I'm so deeply sorry for the role I unknowingly played in this." I told him I understood, and I meant it. But I also understood, hanging up that phone, that the specific cruelty of what Richard had done extended even into the language he had chosen to use while performing his betrayal. A man so thoroughly committed to the narrative of his own deserved happiness that he had not even paused to consider the basic decency of using more careful words while his actual wife lay in surgery just floors away. I want to tell you what I ultimately decided to do because I think this is the part of the story that matters most, and I want to be completely honest about it. I did not forgive Richard. I want to state that plainly without any softening because I have encountered enough stories of betrayal that eventually arrive at some gentle, redemptive conclusion, some quiet acceptance that healing requires forgiveness, that I think it is important to say clearly. I do not believe that. I do not believe every betrayal deserves an eventual path toward reconciliation. I do not believe forgiveness is owed to every person who asks for it, regardless of the scope and calculation of what they did. What Richard did was not a moment of weakness, a single bad decision made in the heat of an affair spiraling out of control. It was a sustained, premeditated, financially motivated scheme that specifically exploited the exact moment I was most physically vulnerable, unconscious, recovering from major surgery, completely unable to protect myself or intervene in any way. He researched my surgical risks. He planned around my potential death. He proceeded with his plan regardless of whether I lived or died, revealing, with devastating clarity, exactly how little my actual well-being had ever factored into his calculations. I pursued every legal avenue available to me. The bigamy charges against Richard resulted in a conviction and a prison sentence, not lengthy by the standards of more violent crimes, but real, documented, permanent consequences for what he had done. The civil case resulted in a settlement that, while it could never fully compensate for the violation itself, at least ensured that he did not financially profit in any way from the calculated scheme he had constructed around my surgery and the insurance policy he had hoped to collect. I have not spoken to Richard since the final day of legal proceedings concluded, over 2 years ago now. I have no plans to ever speak to him again. I do not wonder how he is doing. I do not feel any lingering curiosity about whether he has found some version of peace or accountability in the years since. I simply do not think about him most days at all, and on the days I do, the feeling that surfaces is not grief or longing or any softened nostalgia for what our marriage once was. It is simply a cold, clear recognition that I survived something most people never have to imagine surviving, and that surviving it required me to fully, completely close a door that I have never once considered reopening. I rebuilt my life over the following 2 years with the same methodical determination I have always brought to building my business. I sold the house Richard and I had shared, unable to imagine continuing to live in a space so thoroughly contaminated by what had happened. I moved into a smaller, brighter apartment closer to my office, a space that belongs entirely to me, with no shared history attached to any of its rooms. My real estate firm, somewhat surprisingly, grew significantly during this period, perhaps because the same focus and precision I once applied to navigating complicated business negotiations found a new, even sharper outlet, once I no longer had to expend any energy maintaining a marriage that I eventually understood had been quietly rotting for far longer than I had ever suspected. I am, today, completely physically recovered from the surgery itself. The actual medical procedure succeeded exactly as intended, leaving me free of the chronic pain that had plagued me for the year before it. I think about that occasionally, the strange, bitter irony of it. The surgery that should have simply been a straightforward medical intervention, a routine if significant procedure to fix a genuine physical problem, instead became the exact backdrop for the most devastating betrayal of my entire life. I do not regret having the surgery. I needed it and it worked. I simply understand now, with permanent clarity, that I will never again allow myself to be that physically vulnerable, unconscious, dependent, trusting completely in someone else's presence and protection, without first ensuring that the people I trust have actually earned that trust through years of consistent, demonstrated reliability, rather than simply assuming it because of a marriage certificate and 9 years of shared history that turned out to mean considerably less than I had ever imagined. I have begun, slowly, to date again, carefully, deliberately, with a level of scrutiny I never once thought to apply before Richard. I am in no hurry. I do not feel the absence of a partner as any kind of urgent wound requiring immediate filling. I have learned, through the hardest possible means, exactly how thoroughly a person can perform devotion while secretly calculating an entirely different outcome, and I am not interested in rushing past that lesson simply for the comfort of having someone beside me again. I think often about the organ music I heard coming up out of anesthesia that afternoon. The sound that I initially dismissed as unrelated background noise. The sound that turned out to be the soundtrack to the most calculated, devastating betrayal I have ever experienced or could have imagined experiencing. I think about Brianna's careful warmth during those pre-surgical consultations, the kindness I genuinely believed was simply good nursing practice that turned out to be reconnaissance for a plan she had been quietly executing for over a year. I think about Richard's hand, holding mine, right up until the anesthesiologist began the countdown that put me under, and the casual, practiced ease with which he then walked away from that hospital bed to marry another woman 3 floors below, regardless of whether I survived what was happening to my body on that operating table. I do not think about these things with the raw, immediate pain I once did. 2 years of distance, of legal accountability pursued and achieved, of methodical rebuilding, have softened the edges of the memory somewhat, the way time eventually softens even the sharpest wounds. But I do not think the memory will ever fully lose its power to unsettle me, and I have decided, finally, that I am at peace with that. Some things should remain capable of unsettling you. Forgetting entirely, moving on so completely that the lesson itself fades along with the pain, would be its own kind of danger. A return to exactly the kind of unguarded trust that made this entire nightmare possible in the first place. I survived. My business survived and grew. My sense of myself, eventually, survived too, rebuilt deliberately and carefully into something more guarded, more discerning, considerably less naive than the woman who once believed, without question, that the man holding her hand before surgery would still be there, faithfully and uncomplicatedly, the moment she woke up. He was not there. He was 3 floors down, marrying someone else, gambling on whether I would live or die and proceeding either way. I will never forgive that. I do not believe I am obligated to. And I have built, in the 2 years since, an entire life that does not require his forgiveness, his explanation, or his continued existence in any meaningful part of my world, in order to feel whole, secure, and finally, completely at peace. That is the whole of what happened and the whole of what I decided to do about it. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just truth, pursued relentlessly through every legal channel available to me, and a life rebuilt afterward on a foundation I trust completely, because I built it entirely myself. I want to go back and describe, in more detail than I gave initially, what the hospital security footage actually revealed, because watching it, which I eventually had to do, as part of the legal proceedings, was its own distinct kind of horror, separate from everything I had already learned through Diane's account, and the discovered text messages. Eleanor arranged for me to view the footage in her office, with a victim's advocate present, several weeks into the investigation. I had resisted watching it initially, telling myself the written summaries were enough, that I did not need to see the actual images of what had happened while I lay unconscious 3 floors above. Eventually, I changed my mind. I decided, to understand completely, rather than living with a version of events constructed entirely from secondhand description. The footage showed Richard leaving the surgical waiting area at 1:47 in the afternoon, exactly as the timeline had indicated. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn that morning when he kissed my forehead and told me he loved me, right before they wheeled me back for surgery. He walked with an easy, unhurried gait down 2 flights of stairs rather than taking the elevator, a small detail that struck me, watching it, as somehow more disturbing than if he had rushed. He was not panicked. He was not racing against time. the way a man might if he were doing something he understood to be deeply wrong and needed to complete quickly before changing his mind.
He was calm.
Methodical. A man executing a plan he had clearly rehearsed extensively in his own mind. The footage from the third-floor hallway showed him meeting Brianna outside the chapel. She was already dressed in the simple white dress she would wear for the ceremony, having apparently changed in a hospital locker room immediately after completing her shift in my surgery. They did not embrace dramatically, the way the footage might have suggested if this were truly some spontaneous, overwhelming declaration of love finally given permission to exist. They simply nodded at each other. The brief, efficient acknowledgement of two people confirming that a plan was proceeding on schedule before walking into the chapel together. I watched that nod more times than I am proud to admit. I kept rewinding the footage, trying to find some flicker of doubt, some hesitation, some visible sign that either of them was experiencing even a fraction of the moral weight of what they were about to do. I found nothing. Just two people, calm and prepared, walking into a room to perform a wedding ceremony while I remained, at that exact moment, still on an operating table with my spine open beneath surgical lights. "You don't need to watch this again," the victim's advocate said gently, after I had rewound the same 15-second clip for the fourth time. "I think you've seen enough to understand what you needed to understand." She was right. I stopped watching after that. But I have never been able to fully erase the image of that calm, unhurried walk down the stairs, the easy efficiency of two people who had clearly rehearsed this moment many times in their own minds before ever actually executing it. I described earlier the discovery of text messages discussing surgical risk percentages, but I want to walk through the broader financial investigation in more detail, because the scope of premeditation it revealed extended even further back than I initially understood. Patrick Soto, the forensic financial investigator Eleanor had retained, spent almost 6 weeks reconstructing the financial relationship between Richard and Brianna, working backward from the wedding date through over a year of bank records, phone records, and digital communications obtained through the discovery process. "I want to walk you through something specific," Patrick told me, during a meeting roughly 2 months into the investigation, sliding a printed timeline across the table between us. 18 months before your surgery. This is well before the affair appears to have become physical, based on the message content. Richard contacted an insurance broker to inquire about increasing the death benefit on your existing life insurance policy. "I remember that," I said slowly, the memory surfacing with a sickening new context. He told me it was a routine update. Standard practice given how much the business had grown. "That's the explanation he gave you," Patrick said. But the broker's notes from that consultation describe Richard asking very specific questions about claim processing timelines, about how quickly a beneficiary could expect to receive payout after a death, about what kinds of medical circumstances might complicate or delay a claim. "He was already planning this," I said, 18 months before the surgery, before I even knew about Brianna. "It appears that way," Patrick said carefully. "Though I want to be precise about what the evidence actually supports. I cannot say with certainty that Richard had already settled on the exact plan that ultimately unfolded, researching surgical risk, timing a wedding to coincide with your procedure. But the insurance inquiry this early, combined with everything that followed, suggests he had begun, at minimum, considering scenarios where your death might become financially advantageous to him, well before any specific surgical date had even been scheduled." I sat with that detail for a long time after our meeting ended. I thought about the 18 months that detail represented, a year and a half during which Richard had apparently been quietly assessing, in the background of an otherwise ordinary marriage, exactly what financial scenarios my potential death might create for him, long before my back pain had even progressed to the point of requiring surgical intervention. It transformed my understanding of the entire scheme retroactively. I had assumed, initially, that the worst of what Richard had done was contained to the specific period surrounding my surgery, the calculated timing, the deliberate exploitation of a single, narrow window of vulnerability. Patrick's investigation revealed something worse, A much longer arc of consideration, of a man slowly, methodically working out, over the better part of 2 years, exactly how my death might serve his interests, well before any of the specific circumstances that eventually made the scheme executable had even materialized. "There's one more thing," Patrick said, near the end of that meeting, sliding a final document across the table. "I want you to see this, though I understand it may be difficult." It was a printout of a search history, recovered from a shared family computer that Richard had apparently forgotten still synced his browsing data, dated approximately 8 months before my surgery. A series of searches. Asterisk spinal fusion surgery survival rate. Complications during anesthesia statistics. Life insurance payout timeline after surgical death. Asterisk, I looked at that printed page for a long time, the clinical, searchable banality of it somehow more disturbing than any dramatic confrontation could have been. My husband had sat somewhere, our home office, perhaps, or his desk at the hospital where he worked, and typed those exact phrases into a search engine, methodically researching the statistical likelihood of my death, months before the surgery had even been formally scheduled. "Thank you for showing me this," I told Patrick, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. I needed to see exactly how far back this actually went. I want to return to my sister Diane's experience that afternoon, because I have only given a brief summary of what she actually witnessed, and I think the full account, which she eventually shared with me in complete, painful detail, several weeks after the initial shock had begun to settle, deserves to be told more thoroughly. "I want to tell you everything," Diane said, sitting with me one evening at her kitchen table, several weeks after my surgery, once I had asked her, finally, to walk me through the entire experience rather than the abbreviated version she had given me in the recovery room. "I think you deserve to know exactly what I saw, even though some of it is going to be hard to hear." "Tell me," I said. "When I couldn't find Richard in your recovery room, I asked the nursing staff if they'd seen him," she said. One of the nurses, not Brianna, a different one, got a strange look on her face and said she thought she'd seen him heading toward the chapel earlier. I didn't understand why that would be significant. I just thought maybe he needed a quiet moment, some kind of prayer or reflection while you were in surgery. I went looking for him there. "What did you see when you got there?" "The chapel door was open," Diane said. "I could hear organ music, the same music you mentioned hearing from your recovery room. I walked toward it, and through the open door, I saw a small crowd. Maybe 8 or 9 people, none of whom I recognized. There was a small altar arrangement, flowers, the kind of modest setup hospital chapels probably keep on hand for exactly this kind of impromptu ceremony. And there was Richard, standing at the front, in a suit I'd never seen him wear before. And Brianna? Standing beside him," Diane said, her voice tightening with the memory. "In a white dress, holding a small bouquet that looked like it had been hastily put together, not the kind of arrangement you'd order weeks in advance for a planned wedding, but something assembled quickly, probably from whatever flowers the hospital gift shop happened to have available that day." "What did you do?" "I stood there," Diane said, "for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, completely unable to process what I was looking at. And then the chaplain, this older man, very warm, very gentle in his demeanor, noticed me standing in the doorway and smiled, and said, 'Are you here for the wedding? It was such a beautiful ceremony. We're just finishing up the paperwork now.' What did you say?" "Nothing at first," Diane admitted. "I think I just stared at him. And then Richard turned and saw me standing there, and Vanessa, I will never forget the look on his face. It wasn't shock, exactly. It wasn't even guilt, not immediately. It was something more like calculation, like he was instantly trying to figure out how much I had seen and how he needed to manage the situation." "What did he say to you?" Diane was quiet for a moment, clearly working up the resolve to continue. He said, "Diane, I know this looks complicated, but I need you to not say anything to Vanessa yet. I need to be the one to explain this to her, in my own way, when the timing is right." Diane's voice cracked slightly. "He was standing there, having just married another woman while you were unconscious from major surgery 3 floors away, and his immediate concern was managing how, and when you would find out, not whether what he'd done was monstrous, but how he could control the narrative around it." I sat with that detail for a long moment, feeling something cold and final settle deeper into place. Even in the immediate aftermath of being discovered, Richard's instinct had not been remorse or panic or any genuine reckoning with what he had just done. It had been strategy, an immediate, calculated attempt to manage the timing and framing of how the truth would eventually reach me, as though the actual betrayal mattered less than ensuring he retained some measure of control over how I processed it. "I didn't listen to him," Diane said. "I walked straight back to your recovery room and told you what I'd seen, exactly as it happened, the moment I found you. I wasn't going to let him control anything about this, not for one more second than he already had." I reached across the table and took my sister's hand. "Thank you," I said, "for not protecting him, for just telling me the truth immediately, even though it was devastating." "I would never have protected him," Diane said. "Not for one second. Not after what I watched him do to you." There is one final detail I want to share because I think it captures, more completely than almost anything else, the specific, calculated coldness underlying everything Richard and Brianna did that day. During the discovery process, Eleanor's team obtained a small set of photographs that had been taken during the chapel ceremony, apparently captured by one of the small group of witnesses present, who had used their personal phone to document the occasion before later, once the scandal became public, deleting the images from their own social media in a panic. Eleanor showed me the photographs during a deposition preparation meeting, asking gently first whether I actually wanted to see them, giving me a clear opportunity to decline. I chose to look. The photographs showed Richard and Brianna standing at the small chapel altar, smiling, his arm around her waist, the kind of ordinary, joyful wedding photograph that could have depicted any couple on any happy occasion, with no visible indication whatsoever that anything unusual or sinister was occurring. That, I think, was the detail that disturbed me most profoundly. Not any visible cruelty in the images themselves, but the complete, seamless ordinariness of them. Two people who looked, in every photograph, exactly like a happy couple celebrating a joyful milestone, with absolutely no trace, in their expressions or their posture, of the surgical incision still being closed 3 floors above them, of the marriage that remained, at that exact moment, still legally valid and entirely unaware of what was occurring. "I keep looking for some sign," I told Eleanor, studying one particular photograph where Brianna was laughing at something just outside the frame. Some indication that either of them was carrying any weight at all about what they were actually doing. "I don't think you're going to find it," Eleanor said gently. "I think that absence is exactly what the photographs are telling you. They weren't carrying any weight, Vanessa. Whatever moral calculation they might have engaged in happened well before this moment, during all those months of planning and researching and waiting. By the time they actually stood at that altar, I think they had already fully convinced themselves that what they were doing was simply claiming something they believed they deserved." I have not looked at those photographs since that deposition preparation meeting. I do not need to. I remember them clearly enough, the easy, untroubled happiness on both of their faces, captured in permanent, undeniable detail at the exact moment they were committing one of the most calculated betrayals I have ever heard described, let alone personally survived. That image, 2 smiling faces, completely untroubled, while my body lay open on an operating table somewhere above them, is the one that will stay with me longest, I think, longer even than the organ music or the security footage or the cold, clinical search history Patrick eventually uncovered. It is the image that finally, completely, closed every door I might have otherwise left open toward eventual forgiveness. There was nothing in those smiling faces that deserved it. I want to describe the criminal sentencing hearing in detail because standing in that courtroom, finally watching the legal system formally acknowledge the scope of what had been done to me, provided a different kind of closure than anything I had experienced up to that point. The hearing took place almost 18 months after my surgery. Richard had, by that point, already pleaded guilty to the bigamy charge as part of a negotiated agreement, avoiding a full trial but still facing sentencing for what the court record formally described as a calculated act of bigamy committed during the defendant's spouse's medical incapacitation, accompanied by evidence of premeditated financial motive. I gave a victim impact statement. I had written it carefully over several weeks, with Eleanor's guidance, working to find language precise enough to capture the full scope of what had happened without descending into the kind of raw, unfocused rage that might undermine the careful, methodical case we had built. I stood at a podium in that courtroom, looking at Richard sitting beside his attorney, his face carrying an expression I had never quite seen on him before, something between resignation and a kind of performed remorse that, by that point, I had learned not to trust in any form. "I want the court to understand something specific," I said, my voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. What happened to me was not a single moment of weakness, a marriage that simply fell apart through ordinary human failing. I have built a successful career on careful attention to detail, on the ability to recognize calculated deception in complicated negotiations. I missed this completely and entirely because my husband spent over a year constructing a deception so thorough, so patient, that even someone trained to notice exactly this kind of calculation had no reason to suspect it. I paused, looking briefly at Richard, who did not meet my eyes. He researched my surgical risks. I continued. He inquired about insurance payout timelines 18 months before any surgery had even been scheduled. He arranged for the woman he had been secretly involved with to be specifically assigned to my surgical team, ensuring she would be present and available the moment her shift ended, regardless of which version of events, my survival or my death, the day actually produced. And then he walked away from my unconscious body to marry her, 3 floors below where I lay recovering from major surgery, apparently indifferent to which outcome he would ultimately need to navigate. The judge, a stern, careful woman named Judge Patricia Holloway, listened to my entire statement without interruption, her expression giving away little, though I noticed her writing something down as I described the insurance inquiry timeline. "I am not asking this court for mercy on Richard Cole's behalf," I said, near the end of my statement. "I am asking this court to recognize the full premeditation involved in what he did, and to ensure that whatever sentence is imposed reflects the genuine danger of a person willing to calculate, in such clinical detail, the financial advantages of his own wife's potential death." When the sentencing was finally handed down, 18 months in state prison for the bigamy conviction, combined with additional consequences from the related fraud charges connected to the insurance scheme, I did not feel triumphant.
I want to be honest about that.
I felt, instead, a kind of exhausted, hard-earned relief, the satisfaction of having pursued accountability relentlessly through every available legal channel, rather than allowing the scope of what had happened to be quietly absorbed into an ordinary, private divorce that might have let Richard avoid any formal, public reckoning at all. "You did something important today," Eleanor told me, as we walked out of the courthouse together. "Not just for yourself. Cases like this, they establish precedent. They make it slightly harder for the next person who might consider doing something similar to convince themselves it would simply be dismissed as an ordinary, private matter between spouses." I thought about that as I drove home that evening, the late afternoon light slanting gold across the highway, the specific weight of the entire ordeal finally beginning, after 18 months, to settle into something more like history than ongoing crisis. I have not yet described what ultimately happened to Brianna, and I think her resolution deserves its own careful account, separate from Richard's, because the legal system ultimately treated her culpability somewhat differently. Brianna's cooperation with prosecutors, providing detailed testimony about the timeline of the affair, the discussions about insurance payouts, the deliberate arrangement to be assigned to my surgical team, resulted in a significantly reduced set of charges compared to what she might otherwise have faced. She ultimately pleaded guilty to a lesser charge related to fraud and conspiracy, avoiding the bigamy charge entirely on the technical grounds that she had not been the party already legally married at the time of the ceremony. She received a sentence of probation, community service, and a formal professional consequence. The state nursing board, upon learning the full details of her conduct, including her deliberate arrangement to be present during my surgery despite the clear conflict of interest and her sustained, calculated involvement in a scheme involving a patient's medical vulnerability, permanently revoked her nursing license. I attended the professional licensing hearing, though I was not required to. I wanted to witness, in person, at least one consequence that directly addressed the specific violation of trust involved in her role as my actual nurse during the exact procedure that had been weaponized against me. She did not look at me during that hearing. She sat with her own attorney, her face carefully composed, offering brief, measured answers to the board's questions about her conduct. When the board's decision was finally announced, permanent revocation, with no possibility of future reinstatement, she showed no visible reaction at all. I left that hearing feeling, finally, that the most direct and specific violation, a healthcare professional exploiting her position of trust during my actual surgical care, had received at least some formal, permanent consequence. She would never again hold a position where she could exploit the particular vulnerability of an unconscious, trusting patient the way she had exploited mine. I do not know what became of her afterward. I have made no effort to find out. I imagine, given the scope of what came out during the proceedings, that her professional reputation within the medical community in our city was permanently and irreparably damaged, regardless of whatever new path she might have eventually pursued. I find I do not particularly care one way or another what that new path looked like. My concern with Brianna Hale ended the moment the licensing board's decision was finalized. Whatever life she has built since then exists entirely outside the boundaries of anything I need to know or process further. People sometimes ask me, when the broader outline of this story eventually surfaces in conversation, what I would tell someone else facing a similarly devastating discovery. Not necessarily this exact scenario, which I recognize is extreme even by the standards of marital betrayal, but the broader experience of discovering that a trusted partner has been capable of premeditated, calculated cruelty far beyond anything you believed possible. I tell them, first, that the legal system, while imperfect and frustratingly slow, is worth pursuing fully and relentlessly when the betrayal involves genuine premeditation and calculation rather than simple human weakness. I understand the impulse to simply walk away quietly, to avoid the exhausting, painful process of depositions and forensic investigations and courtroom testimony. But I believe, having lived through that exhausting process myself, that it provided something a quiet, private divorce never could have, a formal, undeniable, externally verified record of exactly what happened and exactly who is responsible. I tell them, second, that forgiveness is not owed simply because someone asks for it, or because enough time has passed, or because the people around you grow tired of watching you carry your anger and begin, gently, to suggest that moving on might require letting go of that anger entirely. I do not believe healing requires forgiveness. I believe healing requires truth, accountability, and the deliberate construction of a new life built on a foundation you trust completely, because you built it yourself, without requiring any further input or resolution from the person who caused the original harm. And I tell them, finally, that surviving something this calculated does not require you to become hardened or permanently incapable of trust. I have, in the 2 years since this all concluded, slowly begun building new relationships, with new business partners, with new friends, eventually carefully with someone I have started dating. I am not permanently closed off. I am simply, now, considerably more attentive to the specific, demonstrated reliability of the people I allow close to me, rather than assuming that reliability automatically based on a marriage certificate, a shared history, or the easy comfort of 9 years together that turned out to conceal something I never once suspected. I woke up from that surgery into a nightmare I could not have imagined, even in my most anxious pre-surgical fears. I pursued every available avenue of accountability with the same methodical determination I have always brought to every serious challenge in my life. And I rebuilt, afterward, a life that belongs entirely to me, physically healed, legally vindicated, and permanently, deliberately unwilling to extend the kind of unguarded trust that made this entire nightmare possible in the first place. That is the whole of what happened, and the whole of what I decided, ultimately, to do about it. Not forgiveness. Just truth, pursued completely, and a life rebuilt afterward on a foundation that no one will ever again be able to quietly dismantle without my knowledge. I think, sometimes, about the version of myself who woke up that afternoon hearing distant organ music and assumed, without a second thought, that it belonged to someone else's story entirely. I think about how completely, how innocently, I trusted that the man holding my hand before surgery would still be exactly where he promised to be when I opened my eyes again. I do not blame that version of myself for the trust she extended. I think trust, freely given to the people who have earned a place in your life through years of apparent devotion, is not a flaw to be corrected. It is simply the ordinary, reasonable foundation most people build their lives on, and it is not my fault, or any failure of judgment on my part, that Richard and Brianna chose to exploit that foundation with such calculated, patient cruelty. What I carry forward now is not regret for having trusted too completely. It is simply a permanent, hard-earned clarity about exactly how thoroughly a person can perform love while secretly calculating its opposite, and exactly how important it is, afterward, to insist on truth rather than settling for whatever softened, comfortable version of events might make reconciliation easier for everyone except the person who is actually harmed. I insisted on the truth. I got it, eventually completely documented and verified through every legal channel available to me. And I built on the other side of that truth, a life that is entirely, finally, my own.